into the Old Testament. The Old Testament. I mean, actually, we're going to spend all of our time in the Old Testament, like all of it this morning. Now, I know, everybody kind of has a thing with the Old Testament. You don't really go there in the modern church. It's like the do not enter. But it's okay, because I've been there before, and I've come back, and I'm still here, so we'll make it. I mean, realistically speaking, it has a pretty bad rep in the modern church. Has anyone kind of experienced that? Have you kind of felt that yourself? I mean, there's Psalms. Psalms is good. Proverbs, I like Proverbs. Maybe some of Ecclesiastes if I'm, feeling risky. But the rest of it's kind of, I mean, it's dangerous territory, right? It really, it doesn't have the best reputation in the modern church. I mean, like I myself, when I was younger, frankly, I hated the Old Testament. I hated it. I would get into it, I'm going to read the Old Testament. I'm going to get into it. I'm going to learn it. I'm going to read it. And I'd spend, an afternoon reading it, and I would find myself just mad. Mad at God, mad at everything. I hated it. Now because, and really this is the problem that most of the modern church has with the Old Testament. Because I would look at the New Testament and I would see that it presented a God of love. A God that loves everybody totally equally with incredible passion. A God who wants all men everywhere to come to him. A God of universal love. That's what I saw in the New Testament. When I went to the Old Testament, it seemed like what I was seeing was a God of brutality. A God who hates everybody except for his special little group. Can you guys relate with that at all? A lot of people can. Most people in the modern church can. Brutal, angry God who only loves his little special group, the Israelites, the Jews. And everyone else is in his bad graces. He beats them up, he destroys them, he blows them up. He hates everybody but the special little group. I mean, am I alone in this at all? Have you ever thought this, kind of been bugged by the Old Testament? It really is a common thing in the modern church. It just is. So this morning, we are going to look at that idea. And we're going to dive right into the Old Testament, into the murky depths. And I think we're going to come out unscathed. We're going to look at that idea that God, the Old Testament God, hates everybody unless you're in his special club. And we're going to do it by looking at one of the more famous stories, I'd say, of the Old Testament. Probably all of us to one level or another have heard of it, are familiar with it, and that is the 10 plagues of Egypt. You guys relatively familiar with that story? The 10 plagues. It's one of the Bible school stories. And I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version just to catch us all up so we're on the same page. A long, long time ago, God made a promise with this guy named Abraham that he would use Abraham's descendants to bless the whole world, kind of his own missionary people. And so years and years down the road, Abraham's descendants find themselves in this nation of Egypt. They kind of have a mutual agreement with the leader of Egypt, this guy named Pharaoh. Every leader of Egypt is named Pharaoh. And they're able to live there and grow there. And they're there for years and years, hundreds of years. The Israelites are in Egypt, and they're thriving, and they're prospering, and they're growing into a pretty sizable nation. And it says somewhere down the line, this Pharaoh showed up who looked at this people group, the Israelites, and said, they're getting pretty big. They're growing a little more than I'm comfortable with. I'm kind of worried they're going to maybe take over one day. And so he decides to put taskmasters over the Israelites. And so essentially the Israelites become these slaves of the Egyptians. And for years and years, the Israelites are the slaves of the Egyptians. And it's poverty, it's brutal, these conditions they're in. They're slaves. And it starts off light, but it develops into full-blown, you are a low-class citizen, you're a slave. And God, again, he made this promise with these guys, ancestors. He says, I'm going to bring them out. I'm going to establish them as my people. And he raises up this leader, and again, I'm trying to fly through this. He raises up this leader named Moses, and I'm sure everybody's heard of Moses. He raises up this leader named Moses, and he says, I want you to go to Egypt. I want you to tell Pharaoh, tell the leader of the Egyptians to let the Israelites go. And after some debate back and forth, Moses goes to Egypt, tells Pharaoh to let him go. Pharaoh says no. And God says, fine, and sends all these plagues upon Egypt over and over and over again, 10 of them in all, until finally Pharaoh says, fine, and the Israelites are released. That is the Cliff Notes version. I've skipped over all the details for your convenience. So that's the story. That's the plague right there. And the common idea, the common conception that most people walk away from or walk away with after reading this story is that God, he really cares about the Israelites, right? He's willing to go to all this trouble to get them out of this wicked nation called Egypt. And the other conception we have is that God really doesn't like the Egyptians. If you read about the plagues, this is not like, oh man, I've got I'm scratchy all over my body or stuff like that. This is it's pretty serious stuff. It gets progressively more and more serious, but it's pretty serious. And so the idea that I came away with as a child was God loves the Israelites and he really kind of hates the Egyptians. The Egyptians are the bad guys, they're the wicked guys. God beats down on them until they do what he says, or until they accept his commands. And so he kind of hates these guys. And again, this is what I thought for years. For years, and I think a lot of people kind of, at one level or another, big bad Egyptians, God hates them. Nice Israelites, God loves them. And one day, again, I had this idea for years. One day, a question occurred to me as I was reading through the story. If God hates these guys so much, if God hates this people group, the Israelites, so much, why wouldn't he just obliterate them? Ever thought about that? If he hates them so much, why wouldn't he just wipe them off of the face of the earth? Because he's proven that he can do that. There's places in the Old Testament where he has done that. Why not just wipe the Egyptians out? It's a whole lot less trouble, frankly. It's a whole lot more simple. It's quick, painless for some. Why would he rather send all of these plagues? Because really, if you read about it, it's a whole lot of trouble for pretty much everyone involved. Why? Why not just obliterate them? And then the answer I had was maybe he just wanted to kind of torture them. This wicked people going to torture you until you do what I say. But that didn't quite sit right with me. Something didn't quite seem right. And so I dedicated a lot of time to figuring out why. Why in the world would God go through all this trouble in giving the plagues to this people he hated so much? And here's what's really interesting. We're going to look at why the plagues instead of obliteration. And the answers are really, really intriguing. So track with me here. I'm going to have to go a little quickly at some points. But what's really interesting is that God himself, at one point, actually tells Moses a bit of his intentions behind giving the plagues. Now, obviously, he's trying to get the Israelites released from Egypt. There's no questioning that. But at one point, he says to Moses, he says, on all the gods of Egypt, I will bring judgment. On all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now, he didn't say on the people of Egypt or on Pharaoh. He says on the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. It's interesting. That's going to be really big for where we're going here. So mark that one in your heads. Now, what's interesting about the Egyptians, this culture at this time, first of all, you should know they're kind of the world's superpower at this point in history. They are the big empire. They're the big one. The other thing you should know is that they're considered at this point in history to be maybe the most religious out of all people groups in the entire world. What I mean by most religious is they had literally hundreds and hundreds of gods and goddesses that pertain to every aspect of their culture. And really, every aspect of their culture. They had a god of the sky, they had a god of the water, they had a god of the rain. Anything you can think of, there was a god for it. And they worshiped these gods. Some were more prominent than others. They were an extremely religious people, and it shaped everything they did. In fact, actually, Pharaoh, their leader, was considered to be a god in the flesh. Every Pharaoh was considered to be a god, the son of Ra. And they believed that this was reality. They truly believed that this was it. Their gods are powerful. Their gods are real. You can really see that belief in Pharaoh's response to when Moses first comes and says, release the Israelites. Moses says, the Lord says, release my people. And Pharaoh says, and just listen for the arrogance here because you can hear it. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. Exodus chapter 5. You hear the tone? Utter disregard. Who is this God? I don't know him. Forget your God. I'm God. And so really the Egyptians were kind of the epitome of a pagan culture at this point. Hundreds and hundreds of gods. Their leader himself is a god. And God says, on all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. He doesn't say the people, he says the gods, and that's intentional. And his message to that mindset is you are wrong. Your way of life is wrong. Your gods are lies, and I'm going to prove it to you. Enter the plagues. Pharaoh says, no, I will not let your people go. Who is this God? Why should I pay attention to him? Forget him. And God says, no. And so really the best way to get the attention of Pharaoh and the entire Egyptian culture is to kind of strike at the heart. And that's exactly what God does with this first plague. So we're going to start looking at the plagues now, and it'll be up on the screen so you can track with me, and it's really fascinating. The first thing he does is he turns water into blood. Miracle of turning water into blood, which is kind of shocking in itself. But it wasn't just any blood for the Egyptians, it was the Nile River. If you guys know anything about Egypt, it's kind of based around the Nile River. Especially at this time in history, that's what they built their nation around. The Nile River was it was their source of culture. It was a huge economic resource. Agriculturally, it was huge. For them, they viewed it as like the lifeblood of their nation. It was huge. So of course, turning the Nile into blood is going to really get their attention really quick. Because it's it's really going to mess things up for a little while. But what's interesting is the Egyptians believed at this time that the Nile River was invincible. They believed nothing could ever happen to it. It's invincible. It's impregnable. Because they had a god named Hapi. Happy. I tried to find a way to pronounce it that was not happy, because then you're thinking of the dwarf. They had a god named Hapi who was the god of the Nile, and that was his job. He's the god of the Nile, and his whole purpose was to protect the Nile. Because it was so important for them. This god of the Nile is his protector, and as long as Hapi is with us, nothing can happen to our lifeblood. And so imagine the shock when you grow up in this culture truly believing, oh, there's the Nile, our heart of our nation, it's invincible. And then suddenly, at the command of some other god from somewhere else you've never heard of, that Nile that's invincible under the protection of Hapi turns into blood. Now that's a huge shock. More than just economically or agriculturally, that's a shock to their basic presuppositions. That says something's wrong with Hapi. How is this other god able to have power over ours? And so that's big. That gets their attention. It doesn't stop there, though. This first strike is only the beginning, because the second plague, and this one's pretty interesting, is an infestation of frogs. In Exodus chapter 8, they come pouring in the thousands out of the bloody Nile. All into Egypt, all over the streets, they're all over the place. And in our culture, we're kind of like, okay, frogs. I mean, I don't love frogs, but I don't hate them. You know. I could be okay with frogs. Maybe the sound would keep me up at night sometimes, but otherwise it's okay. For the Egyptians, frogs stood for something more. They had a goddess who was the goddess of life, like the goddess of life and fertility named Hecate. And if you can see the picture over there, do you notice anything about the goddess of fertility and life. I taught this once and someone said, she's green. Well, yes. She's a frog. Hecate, the goddess of life and fertility for the Egyptians, over all of, now really, every pagan religion has a god of, or goddess of life and fertility. It's a big one. Their goddess of life and fertility was in the image of a frog, and for the Egyptians, the frog was an image of their goddess of life. They revered it. They treaded lightly around the frog. So maybe at first they see thousands of frogs streaming out and they're thinking, this is good. Our goddess is going to bless us. But what's interesting is this. The image of their goddess of life and fertility streams onto the shore, and then the Bible says they died in the thousands. And it says they were piled up in the streets and they stank. And for the Egyptians, their goddess of life and fertility, the image comes pouring out of the bloody Nile in the thousands and dies everywhere. What does that say to them? Something's wrong with Hecate. How did this other god do that? And God says again, your God is a lie. The third plague continues this thing. It's an infestation of gnats. Now, they didn't have a gnat god. They didn't worship the gnat. Gnats are just kind of universally an annoying creature. Sorry, gnats. They just are. I mean, there's no culture that's like, oh, the gnat, I love the majestic gnat. It's universally annoying, you know? But here's what's interesting. There's no gnat god, but what is intriguing is the way the gnats come about. God didn't say, raise your hands and I'll send a swarm of gnats from the sky. He told Aaron, who's Moses' brother, kind of the priest, he says, take your staff and hit the ground. Now, the Egyptians viewed the ground as the domain of their god Geb. The ground, the dirt, the dust, it was his domain. And they viewed when they were walking in Geb's territory, Geb is with us. This is Geb's domain. And it would have been really easy for God to say, raise your hands and the gnats will fly from the sky. But he said, strike the ground. And it says the dust flew into the air. And the dust became gnats that infested Egypt. What does that say to the Egyptians? What's wrong with Geb? Why does this God have power over Geb? Geb's domain, the dust, scattered into the air and transformed into the universally annoying creature, infests their entire nation. Something's up. And what's also really interesting here, there were magicians in Egypt at this time who would, and we don't have time to go into Egyptians or black magic or whatever, but there were magicians in Egypt and they would perform, whatever kinds of magic. And it says at this point that they tried to replicate this plague. They tried to take the dust and turn it into gnats. Now the Egyptians found their power through their god Set, the god of the desert magicians. He had many roles, but one of them was he was the god over all the magicians. He gave them their power and their authority. And they attempted to transform the dust into gnats just like this other god did. And it says they failed. And it's really interesting because at this point it says the magicians, after failing to replicate what the God of the Israelites did, it says they recognized the finger of God. In other words, they recognized there's something bigger than them at play here. They recognize there's something greater in the mix. And you have to know that if the magicians of Egypt, who are more entangled in the culture than the average Egyptian would be, if the magicians are recognizing that something is up, something is wrong with their God, something is different about this other God, you have to know that the average Egyptian is going, what's going on? Everything they believe is being shaken up right now. The fourth plague is an infestation of flies. Now there's a distinction for the Egyptians at this time between a fly and a gnat. They're obviously different creatures. But for the Egyptians, they actually respected flies, believe it or not. And of course, This is because they had a goddess actually, of rebirth, renewal, and resurrection that was depicted in one of two ways, either with the head of a scarab, as seen there, or the head of a fly. And so when they saw a fly, unlike a gnat, they would tread a little lighter. They'd walk in more reverence because that was the image of their goddess Kefera. And suddenly these flies come pouring into Egypt and infest them just as the annoying gnats did. This image of their god is suddenly a bother. Moving along here, the fifth plague in Exodus 9 is the death of livestock. Livestock meaning cattle. Now for the Egyptians and for many, many cultures in this day, just as the Nile was a really huge part of their economic and agricultural lifestyle, cows were as well. They were a huge they were a huge economic resource. They just were. Really, really big. That's one of the reasons Egypt rose to prominence, is because of their cow resource. Now they had a goddess, as many pagan cultures do, of love and of beauty. This goddess, and it's a little different to see, do you see the thing on the top of her head there? That's how they depicted their cows, with those horns and the circle in between it. Hathor was known as the cow goddess of love and of beauty. And so for them, more than just being a huge resource that shaped their culture, the cow was a symbol of everything that was beautiful, everything that was lovely. It's an interesting pick, frankly. I feel like there might have been a better animal out there. But that's the way it was. And more than just that, there were two other gods, major gods that they worshipped, who, not even looking in the form of a human, they were just in the form of cows. You can see the prominence of cows in the way that Israel came out of Egypt and years later built a golden calf that's coming from all the years they spent in Egypt, the prominence of cows in their worship. And suddenly this huge economic resource, this image of many of their gods, at the word of another god, they fall over dead all over Egypt. It's beginning to get profound for the Egyptians. And again, it's happening over and over and over again that the superiority of the Israelite God is being demonstrated. The sixth plague is an outbreak of boils or sores on the body. Now, there are actually two gods that this really kind of makes them impotent here. The first is Sekhmet, the Egyptian god of healing and of disease. The Egyptians viewed any disease as being under the domain of Sekhmet. Sekhmet gives diseases. Sekhmet can take away diseases. And so when all of Egypt is stricken with these diseases, including the magicians, by the way, they're unable to do anything about it. Something's wrong with Sekhmet. And furthermore, Imhotep, I might be pronouncing that wrong, Imhotep, I don't know, who's the god of healing sciences. And if you study the Egyptian culture at this point in history, they were really, really into cleanliness. It was a huge part of their culture, a huge part of their religious practices. And they were really into many different ways of curing diseases, various healing sciences that a lot of them were pretty wacky. Rub the dung of whatever on your arm, stuff like that. And their god of healing sciences is completely unable to do anything for these sores. And what's really interesting is these sores, all over the Egyptians, pronounce their entire culture unclean by their own standards. Culturally and religiously, they're unclean. According to the religion, only someone who is clean, only those who are not unclean can stand before Pharaoh. And what's especially striking here is all the Egyptians are unclean. The court is emptied before Pharaoh, and the only two people who are before Pharaoh are Moses and Aaron, the prophets of the living God. Isn't that striking? And over and over and over again in these plagues, God powerfully pronounces these Egyptian gods to be lies, to be powerless. And for the sake of time, we'll go through these last four really quickly. The seventh, hail came from the heavens, which were supposed to be protected by their goddess Nut. The eighth plague was an infestation of locusts. which destroyed their crops, which were supposed to be under the protection of the god Osiris. The 9th plague, darkness came over the sun. And I'm sure you guys have all heard of Ra, the god of the sun, to be blotted out before them, the head of their gods. It's profound. And finally, the most tragic of all, the death of the firstborns, which is a strike at the protection they had by all their gods. Basically, in one sweep saying, your gods are nothing. Over and over and over again after these plagues, Pharaoh would say, no, 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 I don't care about your God. He's nothing. And Pharaoh, who is the firstborn son, was viewed as God in the flesh, and the firstborn sons are taken. And it's the death knell. And after these 10 plagues, finally Pharaoh relents. He says, let the Israelites go. And the psychological and religious effects of these plagues on the Egyptians at this point had to have been profound. You saw how the magicians were reacting only after 3 plagues. After the 10th, when God in the flesh, Pharaoh, gives in, imagine what the rest of their culture is doing. Profound effects. And again, the Egyptians, whose initial response was, who is this God? I do not know this God. Disregard. They've been shaken to their very core. Their gods are proven to be lies. Everything they believed to be true since their birth has been shaken up. And so let's go back all the way to the original question, because this is all very interesting, but it doesn't mean anything if we don't get to the why. Why did God go through all this trouble? What's his aim? Now, he breaks up their messed up worldview. He's showing them that their gods are nothing. Their gods are powerless. Everything they've focused their lives around is wrong, is a lie. He goes way out of his way. I mean, if you think about it, this is way out of his way to prove all of this to them. Why is he so concerned about these people that he hates so much? The answer, really, I think, can be found in a passage later in the Old Testament, in the book of Isaiah. In God's own words, he says in Isaiah 19, blessed be Egypt, my people. He says, blessed be Egypt, my people. My people. God, hear this, God, according to this, considered Egypt and the Egyptians every bit as much his people as the Israelites. The Egyptians were his beloved children, and he wanted them back. You hear that? My people. Not my enemies, my people. And the fact that we're presented with here is he desperately loves these people. He desperately wants them to turn to him. And he goes through all this trouble to break up this messed up worldview they've been living in. I think maybe we could say, maybe as much as he wanted the Israelites to be free, maybe as much as he wanted the Israelites to be free, he wanted the Egyptians to turn to him. And really, they become so entrenched in this way of life. This was their presupposition from beginning to end. These gods are what is real. And we can see by their reaction to the command of the true God, there was no way God was going to get to them any other way. He had to go through all this trouble to shake up their beliefs. God, their creator, held no interest for them. Disregard. And God says, no, please, stop hurting yourselves. Please, please. And finally he says, I don't want you to have to be living in this anymore. I'm going to show you. And you know what's really interesting? At the end of all this, at the end of all these plagues, Exodus makes a special point to mention this. It says, as the Israelites came out of Egypt, a mixed multitude also went up with them. You know what that means? It means Egyptians left Egypt and became Israelites from this point on. You never hear another mention about the Egyptians that were with the Israelites anywhere else in the Bible. These Egyptians saw the reality of the true God, and they said, my life has been lived wrong. And they left, and they came out with the Israelites, and they turned to God. And you never hear mention of them again because they became God's people, God's chosen group. They became it right there because they responded to his pursuit after them. I mean, once you get that the plagues are God's incredible pursuit, he could have obliterated them just like that. Problem solved. Israelites released. But he went through all this trouble to show the Egyptians their way of living was wrong. And it worked. It worked. Not for all of them, obviously. We know that Pharaoh stayed bitter and arrogant to the end. But for some of them, it did. For some of them, it responded and they turned to him. And this concept we have that the Old Testament God is hateful to everyone but the Israelites is wrong. It is wrong. Because the fact is that God is willing to go to these lengths for every single person in the Old Testament. Was willing. Just as he loved everyone back then, he loves everyone today. This is just the character of God. This lie that's perpetrated the modern church to the Old Testament God as a big bully is just a lie. It's destructive. God is loving then, God is loving now, and he will continue to be loving in the future. And what's interesting is he's willing to go to such lengths for these people, and he's willing to go to such lengths for every single one of us here today. Everyone you know, everyone you've ever known, everyone you've ever seen. That kind of intensity is the heart of God. Isn't that interesting? And yet we look at the Old Testament and go, look at this angry jerk. And that's the heart of God. To see those people respond to him. However small the group, he goes to that length to get them to turn. And that's fascinating to me. So as we close here and have the band come up and begin to play, I want to challenge all of us to ingrain it in our heads that God is love. These are words of the Bible, and I just went into the New Testament, sorry. God is love for every single one of us, everyone you've ever met. The Old Testament God isn't a hateful beast. He's full of love. Desperate love. Isn't it interesting when you look, when you really look at the Old Testament, suddenly you see a different picture. So Father, we're so grateful to you that you are just loving. We're so grateful that you're full of love and care for us. That you tolerate us, and more, that you pursue us, God. Thank you that you're reliable. Thank you that you're constant and you're consistent. There's almost nothing that is consistent on earth, God, but you are. Please teach us, Father. Teach us how to love like you do. Teach us how to live in your love, God. Help us to respond to your love and your pursuit of us every day. Turn to you as those few Egyptians did.